So what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is one of the most remarkable, but I think it's fair to say also the most enigmatic and really genuinely puzzling archaeological discoveries that has ever been made in County Kilkenny. That's the Roman burial, recorded as having been found in 1852 near Stoneyford in County Kilkenny. So according to the original account of the discovery, which, as we'll see, it's far from straightforward. This was a fully early Roman style cist burial, so a human cremation in a glass urn. This urn here had a human cremation in it, and this was covered by a silvered bronze mirror, which is this fella up here, and then it was accompanied by a glass phial, this one here, containing ointment. That's what they found in 1852. Now, the importance of this burial, it really can't be overstated, because it provides one of the clearest indicators that we have of direct contact between Ireland and the Roman world. And perhaps intriguingly, it also provides us, by implication, with an actual Roman settlement here in County Kilkenny. Now, the problem is that there's loads of problems with this. Because, first of all, the precise find circumstances and the actual find spot itself in 1852, they weren't recorded. So there's always been a suspicion here that it could have been a hoax. And I think it's also fair to say its importance has been largely downplayed by Irish archaeologists. It's always been kind of fobbed off maybe as something that's just a little bit suspicious, or maybe this was an Irish person who had, brought in these burial items, and it's always about downplaying the Roman element of this. And it's also remarkable, I think, that despite this being the westernmost early Roman burial in Europe, and absolutely fundamental to understanding the reach of the empire outside of Ireland and outside of the formal frontiers of the empire, Stoneyford barely figures at all in the work of Roman archaeologists in Britain and further afield. So it's been kind of, hammered from both sides. So what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is the work that I've been doing to try and figure out, first of all, is this actually a genuine discovery? And then, if it is, where exactly was it found? And what sort of burial monument was it found in? And then the big question, can we identify the Holy Grail of a Roman settlement here associated with the burial? So the Roman settlement of the community who buried this person, presumably somewhere nearby. And I hope all of this will try and kind of rebalance the Stoneyford's place in our understanding of the Roman impact on Ireland and Ireland's impact on the Roman world as well. So around the time of the burial in the 2nd century AD, you can see from the map here that the Roman Empire, it encompassed about 100 million people, would you believe, divided amongst about 40 modern countries. So it's stretching from the deserts over here in Syria, along the North African coast, all the way up to the windswept hills of the north of England. So it's this vast empire. And in AD 43, the Claudian invasion of Britain began. And about 17 years later, that brings the western frontier of the empire to literally within sight of Ireland at Anglesey. And here's a view of the Wicklow Mountains from Anglesey, which is just 50 kilometres away. And we know that back in about 60 AD, the then governor of Britannia, Paulinus, he's there and he's considering taking the country that the Romans at the time called Hibernia, the land of winter. And weren't they right in describing it as such? About 20 years later then, we have the Roman, about AD 80 or so, we have the Roman historian Tacitus. He tells us that Agricola, who's the great general who's responsible for the conquest of northern Britain, he's famously, again, he's considering an invasion of Ireland from what he calls the trackless wastes of Galloway, which is up to the north of here. However, we know this never happened. And because of this, we don't have any of the Roman forts or the villas or the planned towns, the Roman roads, the mosaics, all that stuff that we all know comes from the Roman world and that are found in Britannia. And really, this has led to this kind of long-standing traditional view, which is very much influenced by our kind of Catholic nationalist history, I would suspect, certainly on this side of the Irish Sea. And maybe on the other side of the Irish Sea, a kind of superior attitude to Ireland's archaeology in general, and basically that our indigenous late Iron Age Celtic society remained proudly independent of Rome. That was the view from here. On the other side, that we were kind of this backwater, isolated from the great empire and trying to figure our way into it towards the end of the Roman period. So the few hundred undisputably Roman objects from Ireland, these are mostly back in when they were first collated in the 1970s. We were talking about mostly coins, pottery, brooches, silverware, a few statues, a range of items. They were not taken as evidence that there was any sort of deep connection with the empire, and certainly they weren't taken as evidence for any sort of Roman settlement here. And instead they were explained away that they were traded to native elites, or that they were simply booty from Irish raids on Britannia, and particularly as the Western Empire was crumbling in the 5th century. And really, it wasn't until the Romano-British Christian missionary, St. Patrick's arrival here on these shores in AD 432, we're told, that we embraced the Roman world, leading to the dawn of Christianity and the dawn of history. So that was the view up until, I'd say, fairly recently, the last maybe 20 years ago anyway. And certainly in recent years, this has been challenged big time, most notably by the Discovery Programme's Late Iron Age and Roman Ireland project, which was led by Jacqueline Cahill and came to an end in 2015, and which I had the great privilege of working on for a time. So between 2011 and 2015, the LIARI project documented over 200 find spots for around 1,500 genuine Roman personal items, hoards, militaria, coins, lamps, a whole range of Roman material. They also identified new sites and settlements, ritual sites, new evidence from isotopes for people living here who had grown up in Roman Britain. They carried out vast geophysical surveys and the like as well. And if you want to have a good read about their work, you can go to their website there. Just Google the LIARI project, Late Iron Roman Ireland project, on the Discovery Programme, and there's a lot of resources there, including the main academic monograph that they produced, which is a fantastic re-evaluation of our interaction with the Roman world. And their work tells us that Roman objects are to be found pretty much throughout Ireland, but there's these discrete geographical clusters. And they're suggesting to us that there was parts of Ireland that were really thoroughly Romanised. And one of the highest concentrations of material that we have here, and one of the few areas as well where there's actual archaeological sites that are Roman or Romanised, they're here in Kilkenny. So the LIARI project argue that, even without a conquest here, there was a far greater level of sustained interaction between Ireland and the Roman world than was once believed. And instead of being this kind of detached backwater to the Roman Empire, we were its dynamic, interconnected western frontier. And you can see here, this is a distribution map, an early distribution map of the known Roman finds in Ireland. And you can see there's a big cluster of them here in County Kilkenny. Another cluster up around the Dublin Meath area as well, as in Tara and Drumanagh, etc. And then some up in the Sandhills in the north here as well, big cluster of them. And here's the map of Kilkenny. And you can see there's Kilkenny City here. All the red stars, they're Roman finds that we have from the Nore Valley. And I'll be talking about them as we go along. Now, the LIARI project, as I said, it came to an end in 2015, and they never got to carry out any archaeological excavations, unfortunately. It was hoped that the project might continue for a time after that, where they might get a chance to go in and excavate some sites. But their conclusions basically have been really spectacularly backed up by the archaeological excavations that many of you might have heard about. It was even on Fox News there recently that Christine Baker, who's the Fingal County Council Community Archaeology Officer, she's been leading at a place called Drumanagh, which is a promontory fort in North County Dublin, and she's been leading archaeological excavations there since 2018. And on Drumanagh, hundreds of Roman objects had been previously discovered through illegal, unlicensed metal detectoring, and they had been caught. The objects had gone to an auction house, and luckily the museum here in Dublin had managed to got the sale stopped, and they got their hands on the objects. So they're all in the National Museum, and Christine's excavations then are producing large quantities of Roman imports, like Spanish olive oil amphora, Samian ware pottery, glass beads, lots of evidence for luxury foods, figs, which is what went up on Fox News. There you go. 2,000-year-old fig unearthed in Ireland marks oldest example of an exotic fruit discovered in the area. And I didn't show it there, but underneath that there's a picture of some archaeological site in Israel, I think, which has absolutely nothing got to do with this. And again, you can read a bit more about Drumanagh and the fantastic archaeological discoveries that are happening there on the Digging Drumanagh website, which is part of the Fingal County Council overall website. So what's really interesting about Drumanagh as well, that there's native objects, Irish objects here on the site that are being manufactured, and there's Roman objects being manufactured on the site as well. Both of them are being manufactured here. There's these things called trumpet brooches, which are a classic Roman type of brooch dating from the 1st century AD or so. And there's moulds of those that have been found on the site. Now, the really interesting thing is that there's never been a trumpet brooch found in Ireland, but there's been loads of them found on the other side of the Irish Sea. And the question is, were they being made in Drumanagh and exported out across the sea to Britannia? So everything that Christine is finding in Drumanagh and from the old metal detected finds suggest that this was a major emporium or a trading hub where both Irish and Roman objects were made and traded. And the big question, I suppose, that we have now is, was this under Roman control? Or was it under native control? Or was it a mix of both? You know, this is a really, really interesting question. So anyway, I think it's clear from what I've said so far that Ireland's relationship with the Roman world, it was far richer, it's more complex, it's more interesting, it's more surprising, I think, than the traditional narrative ever allowed. And all of this, I think, makes it even more important that we figure out as much as we can about the Roman burial at Stoneyford. So to do that, we need to go right back to the beginning. We need to go back to the 19th of May 1852, when the landlord and the sometime antiquities collector, a guy called William Prim Perry of Cottrell's Booley near Stoneyford, he knocks on the door of the Royal Irish Academy, which was then in 1852 in Navigation House, which is 112 Grafton Street. I am reliably informed it is now the Mango store on Grafton Street in Dublin. Here's an old photograph of it. So William Prim Perry knocks on the door here, and he's there to meet his cousin William Clibborn, who's the curator of the Academy's museum, which until the late 19th century, this was where the main archaeological collections in Ireland were housed. So this is where things like the Tara brooch was here, the Cross of Cong, the Ardagh chalice, they were all in this particular collection. So Perry opens up his suitcase or whatever he was carrying the items in, and he reveals 6 objects which Clibborn then sketches and records in his personal scrapbook, and that's now in the Royal Irish Academy Library on Dawson Street. A really fascinating collection of sketches and rubbings and notes on Irish monuments and artefacts, and to the best of my knowledge, I don't think most of it has ever actually been published. So this is the page from Clibborn's scrapbook. I was up there the other day and I had a good look at it. I wanted to make sure that I caught everything, so I even brought a little torch with me, and I was looking through the light to see was there anything that hadn't been caught before. But everything that is known about the find is recorded on this sketch here. So 3 of Perry's objects then: an intact glass jar or urn containing the cremated human remains, the circular bronze mirror which covered its lid, as I said already, and then the glass phial or the lacotrime were, according to Clibborn's contemporary notes in his scrapbook, they're found together in a rath. So he's written all this here. So you can see that articles exhibited this 19th of May 1852 by Mr. Perry, blah, blah, blah. And he talks about them being found in a rath and protected with stones in a field of his near Stoneyford in County Kilkenny. And then the 3 other objects were, again, they're the 3 up here. 1, 2, 3, up at the top of the page. And according to Clibborn's notes, again, they're found somewhere nearby, in quotes. And what this is it's a hoard of Irish copies of late Roman objects. So we have a so-called nail cleaner here, and the nail cleaner here, and then there's this hooked toilet implement, as it's called, and a finger ring. And originally this had little glass inlays in it. So these have been dated by the late Ryan O'Flynn to the 5th or 6th century AD, so the very, very start of the early medieval period. So after Perry's death in 1879 then, much of his collection, which seems to have been quite extensive, it was obtained by the Royal Irish Academy in 1881, so 2 years after his death. And then this is transferred in 1890, along with the rest of the Royal Irish Academy's antiquities collection, to the new Museum of Science and Art, which later becomes the National Museum of Ireland. Now, you would have thought that such a spectacular discovery as this would have been big news at the time, but there's absolutely nothing about it. All we have is that there's no mention of it whatsoever in the transactions of the Kilkenny Archaeological Society, despite the fact that the secretaries at the time of the society were Perry's cousins and neighbours, the great antiquarians James Graves and John Prim. And I've trawled through Graves and Prim's correspondence looking for any kind of anything about these discoveries, and there's nothing. There's nothing in Carrigan, there's nothing in any of the local histories, and to the best of my knowledge, there's very little local knowledge of the find. If there's anybody here from Stoneyford direction who has anything that they can add to the story, do please grab me after this and let me know, because I've talked to a lot of locals and nobody seems to have any sort of memory of it. Barely anything was published on the Roman burial as well until 1973, and when it was first included in J.D. Bateson's of the Ulster Museum, his catalogue of Roman material from Ireland, which is in the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy. And he just had a very short note on it. And the other problem was that at that stage, the urn and the file had gone missing. And they were only rediscovered in 1987 when broken fragments of both of these, unfortunately minus the cremation, were found in the collection of the Art and Industry Division of the National Museum of Ireland, where they had been since the case in which they had been housed there had collapsed in a flood in 1914. There had been a whole series of Roman glass implements, items in that case, and it had fallen and everything had smashed to bits. So from the fragments that were found, Ed Burke, who's a colleague of mine now in the National Monument Service, along with the conservator Aideen Kennedy, who did a lot of work here in Roth House back in the day as well, has to be said. They pieced the urn back together and published it. Firstly, in the 1989 summer edition of Archaeology Ireland, and then Ed published it in detail in his 1994 paper on early glass in Ireland, which was published in the Journal of the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland. And then this led, once it was published, it led to a bit of a kerfuffle, a bit of controversy. And some archaeologists, including the late Nell Prendergast of this parish, she was a real trailblazer in Irish archaeology, and I think she was one of the very first keepers of antiquities in the national, the female keeper of antiquities in the National Museum of Ireland. And she argued that it was a hoax because, as I said, it had never been mentioned by Graves and Prim. She said that the supposed finder, William Perry, he was an absentee landlord and it was unlikely to have been there when the find was actually discovered in the first place. And then she made the very realistic point that Perry's Clibborn's description of it as having been found in a rath, which you'd think was an early medieval ring fort, that just wouldn't make sense because they're much younger than the Roman finds. However, I think it's fair to say that today there's many Irish archaeologists that would accept this as a genuine. Although I have to say maybe a bit too readily, given the amount of evidence that we actually have for it. The main reasons for this are that the burial rite is absolutely typical for Roman Britannia. And since nothing like this had ever been found in Ireland in up to the mid-19th century that we know of, it would have been really difficult for Perry to actually make it up. And Dr. Aideen Ireland, who has also been looking into this in a lot of detail, she's pointed out if Perry could somehow have gone and obtained a Roman burial like this from some foreign source, he's a well-established collector, and it seems really unlikely that he would have lied to his cousin Edward Clibborn about this by trying to pass it off as being a genuine Irish discovery. So they're the two reasons that have been given as to why it we've nothing to worry about here. It's fine. But then on the other side, there's still a lot of people who had their misgivings about this. And really, it's because so little is known of the find circumstances. There's always going to be a bit of uncertainty there, And my own thoughts on it have always been that we needed something stronger. We needed direct evidence to inform us one way or the other. And maybe one way to move things along was to try and identify where the objects might have been found on Perry's land, and whether there was a type of monument there where they were found that would be typical for a Roman burial. Now, before I get into this, because that's exactly what I did, I went off and had a good look to see could I figure out exactly where it was found. Before I get into that, let's take a look at the three burial objects themselves, because they have a very interesting story to tell themselves. So firstly, this is the glass jar from Stoneyford. It's a green-blue ovoid, and it's got this flattened rim here, closely datable to the late 1st, early 2nd century AD. The beauty of Roman artefacts is that they can be very, very closely dated, and this is a good example of this. These sort of jars, they're really widespread domestic storage vessels in the Roman world. They're often reused, sometimes expressly made for funerary purposes. And you can see that this is a photograph I took of it a couple of years ago, and you can still see the cracks there from where it fell in 1914 and was pieced back together in 1987. So from Ireland, we only have 3 other known glass urns like this. There's one that's now lost from Drumanagh in County Antrim, and then there's 2 unprovenanced antiquarian finds. One of those is in the National Museum of Ireland, and again I had a look at that there only a couple of weeks ago. And when this urn was found, as I said already, it contained cremated remains, and unfortunately they're now lost. Maybe they will turn up someday in the crypt of the National Museum or something, but which would be great. And in the first 2 centuries of the Roman occupation of Britain, cremation is the primary funerary practice. And Tacitus, again, he tells us that it was the Romanus mos, so the Roman way of burial. And it's not until Christianity that we start to get the whole skeleton inhumation becoming commonplace again. So it's really unfortunate that the cremation doesn't survive, because there's been huge advances in recent years in how we study cremated remains. They can be directly radiocarbon dated. Osteoarchaeologists can tell an awful lot of biological data from the piecing together the bones. You have to be really good at jigsaws, but so it's not just ash. This back in prehistoric times, when a body is cremated, it turns into loads of little fragments of bone and they can be identified, to where they come from and on the body, and we get loads of information from them. And then there's a thing called strontium isotope analysis, and that can be done on a thing called the petrous bone, which is this really hard little bone that we all have in our ears. And this preserves this strontium ratio, which is what we absorbed during our childhood from the food and the water in your local area. And that chemical signature can be extracted from the petrous bone, and it's amazing. It can tell you where an individual grew up. Analysis of the cremated bone, it also tells us a lot about the funerary practices as well, and the processes, how the pyre functions. If the bone is only partially burnt, it can tell you that the pyre mightn't have been tended as well as it should have been, because for the bone to completely break down, it needs to be completely white. And you often see in cremations that some of it is white and some of it is grey and black, and so it can tell you a bit about the pyre technology. So as I said, hopefully someday this cremation from Stoneyford does turn up somewhere, and because we could do an awful lot with it. But cremations in glass jars like that from Stoneyford, they're really relatively commonly used, but lead urns were the rarest and the most expensive. So there's examples from Colchester Museum. There's an example of an urn like the Stoneyford one from Colchester. And we get these lovely ceramic face pots as well. So the most common funerary vessels were made from pottery, and they're grey ware and black burnished ware jars. And then you get these kind of odd little ones, these so-called face pots as well. But we're pretty certain that most people weren't buried in a pot of any sort, and they might have been buried in something organic that doesn't survive. So they're kind of the silent majority of the population of Roman Britain. So that's the urn. The little phial then, or the unguentarium, or antiquarians used to call these lacrimotries, the idea being that they used to collect the tears of the mourners, and then that would be placed in the grave with the remains. That was also broken, as you can see here, in 1914, so the neck is missing. The Stoneyford example, it's the kind of commonest form of these phials that we have. So it originally had the long cylindrical neck, little conical reservoir, and amazingly, if you can make that out there, do you see that white stuff? That's the remains of the ointment. 2,000 years later, that was in this little vial, used in the burial, and still survives today. So these are often found with cremations. They're usually distorted by fire, and the idea is that these held oils and ointments and things like that were used to anoint the body. And both of these vessels are products of the Roman glass industry, which really, in its scale, its scientific prowess and its organisation, really quite astonishing, the scale of this industry. The only equivalent would be the 18th century glass industry in Europe. It was just absolutely astonishing what they were able to do. Firstly, all Roman glass is made from two things: sand from the beaches of the eastern Mediterranean. In the 1st century AD, when our Roman urn was deposited in Stoneyford, the sand, most of it came from the beaches of Palestine, would you believe? And the second thing is a soda flux. So flux, this is what's needed to lower the temperature so that the sand could melt and form the raw glass. And the stuff that they used at this time it's called natron. And this comes from these great alkali lakes that are found in the Natron Valley in Egypt. And that's the salt deposit, the natron salt that you can still go to there today, and there's loads of it. So the sand and the natron, then they're fused into these big blocks of raw glass, and they're fused in these rectangular tank furnaces. And there's loads of these that are located all along the Mediterranean coast there and the North African coast. The idea then was that the raw glass, it's broken up and it's exported then to glass workshops throughout the empire, where it's remelted and it's worked then into the finished products. So where might the Stoneyford vessel have actually been made? So we know the raw glass definitely came from the Mediterranean, but where was it actually made? Probably Britain and exported across the sea, but it's not impossible, I would suggest, that it was made in Ireland. The excavations at Drumanagh have been really interesting in that they've uncovered little glass droplets which suggest that there might have been secondary glass working taking place there. And the technique that was used by the Romans, it was glass blowing, invented about the mid-1st century BC. And you can see there's a lovely little depiction of a glass blower here on this lamp, this Roman lamp from Slovenia. And this is a reconstruction of what a Roman secondary glass workshop would have looked like. And glass blowing allowed for mass production on a vast scale for a whole range of glass tablewares and storage containers like the Stoneyford vessel, and particularly window glass. That seems to have been the main product that came out of the glass industry. Now, in Ireland, certainly compared to Britain, we've very, very little Roman glass has been recognised here. We have Stoneyford, and then we have the late Roman drinking vessels from the Rathduff on the hill of Tara. They're probably the two most significant assemblages that we have. There's a bit from Drumanagh, and there's a few fragments here and there elsewhere. Probably a lot of Roman glass has gone unrecognised, I would suggest. And the other thing you have to remember is that an awful lot of it was probably recycled into vessels in later periods, in the early medieval period. Certainly in Britain, we find that there's a huge amount of recycling of Roman glass going all the way up to the 8th or 9th century AD. The third object from the burial then is this silvered bronze mirror, and this, remember, according to Cliburn, this was used as the lid of the last cinerary urn. And it's decorated with these two little concentric circles on its concave side, on the back side. And then if you look at the business side of it, this is where you had to look at yourself. That's the convex side. You'll see there's a little bit of silvering here remaining around the side of it. So it was well worn. There's been experiments done with these mirrors. You can't really see an awful lot of yourself in them, which I'm sure is why the Romans all thought they were only gorgeous. We don't have any trace of any kind of solder that might suggest that there was a handle on this particular mirror. So it's likely to have been a hand mirror or maybe mounted in a frame, a bit like this one that is from Winchester in England. So this is more typical Roman mirror with a lovely handle here. So what it is, it's a late 1st, early 2nd century. So again, exactly contemporary with the urn and the vial. It's a provincial Roman mirror that was imported maybe from where they were making similar ones in a place called Nijmegen, which is in the lower Rhine. And what they're doing there is they're mass producing these mirrors, and then they're copying the authentic ones that are found in southern Italy. There's loads of them in Pompeii, for example. It's one of 4, maybe 5 mirrors that we know of from Ireland. There's one from Lambay. We have one reported maybe 2 from Drumanagh. There's a now lost one from that place up in County Antrim, Drumanagh, that I already mentioned. And then there's a place called Ballymooney where there's a handle from there as well. So they're very, very rare in Ireland. And the mare has been generally used to infer that the individual who was buried here at Stoneyford, that they were female. But there's been studies done of this. People like Robert Philpott has looked into this, and they've demonstrated that really grave goods cannot be taken to imply the sex of the individual. And there's plenty of examples of where there's male and young children have been buried with mirrors. So it's not necessarily an indication that this was a female who was buried at Stoneyford. And what is pretty clear is that the mirrors had some kind of a ritual function within the funerary environment. The idea, I think, from what I can tell, is that they were protecting the deceased from evil and aiding them to achieve immortality. So that's the objects from the Roman burial. Now, let's get back to where the heck were they found. And remember, here's Clibburn's sketch again from 1852. He's describing that they're found together in a rath and protected with stones in a field of his, in the field of Perry's field near Stoneyford in County Kilkenny. Now, in the 19th century, the term rath, it was just this generic term that applied to all sorts of earthwork enclosures and mounds and barrows, and it didn't necessarily have to mean this was an early medieval ring fort. So what I did first was I had a look to see were there any earthwork monuments on Perry's lands near Stoneyford, and if we figured out from Griffith's valuation, which 1850, 2 years before the discovery, where Perry's land holdings actually were, and we were able to narrow it down using that. There's only 2 monuments on Perry's lands near Stoneyford. Both of them are marked on the first edition Ordnance Survey map, which is 1840 again, so they almost certainly were there in 1852 when the stuff was found. They're both very close to where Perry lived, which today it's a house just south of Scoil Nefa on the Knockadrina road. So there's Perry's house. This is first edition Ordnance Survey map. There's Stoneyford. There's Perry's house. And there's there's this barrow here, which is on his land, and then there's this other ring barrow here, which isn't on his land. Okay. And then there's a site down here in Cotter's Booley, which is also on his land, but it does seem to be an absolutely typical ring fort, and probably much younger than the find. So the most promising one of these, it's about 550 metres northeast of Perry's land. It's in Ballycombe townland. Here it is. It's also shown on the subsequent OS maps, and it's recorded in the Sites and Monuments record as a subcircular mound enclosure, a barrow about 25 metres across. So you can see it there. If you go there today, you'll notice you're on a low ridge. You're about 1.3 kilometres from the River Nore to the east here, and then you've got the King's River coming in here. And if you stand here today, it's a great view over the valley of the King's River. Now, unfortunately, in the 1990s, this monument might have lasted for 2,000 years, but in the 1990s, the site was partially levelled. But there's still some traces of a mound here, and there's an enclosure visible on the ground. So that's the site today. You can just make out a little bit of the enclosure here, and maybe a mound. You see that? Yeah. House. I've talked to some of the locals who live nearby, and they describe remembering in their childhood that there was a great ditch around this and a big mound in the middle, and they used to play in the ditch, and
played kind of Robin Hood and stuff on the monument before it was destroyed. And then that's the one we're interested in. This is the one that isn't on Perry's land, just to the southeast of it. There it is on the first edition. Also interesting, this seems to be a ring barrow as well. It is shown on the first edition Organ Survey map as kind of almost a rectangular looking earthwork mound. So, you're thinking here, could this be, you've got two ring barrows. Usually where there's two, there's lots of other ones that have been since destroyed. And are you looking at something more substantial? Was this a barrow cemetery at some time? Many of you know, of course, ring barrows, they're generally Bronze Age or Iron Age burial sites. They're typically defined as the circular enclosures of earth. They often feature a bank with an internal ditch, and then that surrounds the burial mound itself. So this is a reconstruction of an English one. And you can see there's the ditch and the burial mound in the middle. Now, in Iron Age Ireland, only a tiny proportion of the population really has been archaeologically excavated. But from what we can tell, the ring barrow does seem to have been the characteristic native burial monument, along with simple pit cremation, which is often very token, and these are the dominant rites. So, for example, about 4 kilometres north of Stoneyford, at a place called Danesfort, there's a ring ditch which was archaeologically excavated ahead of the M9 motorway by Richard Jennings back about 15 years ago or so. And this has been radiocarbon dated, and it's roughly the same age as the Roman finds from Stoneyford. It gets more intriguing here because there's about 100 Roman barrows that are known in Britain. Mainly they're found in the southeast lowlands of England, and then there's some up around Hadrian's Wall, and there's a few in Wales as well. They're found in the Rhineland and in Belgium as well. And some of these are highly elaborate, like these ones here in the Barclow Hills in Cambridgeshire. You can see they're massive. This drawing here might be a bit fanciful, but it does give you an idea of the scale of the barrow mounds. And that's them today, Barclow Hills. The more typical ones, they look like this, big mounds of earth. And within the Roman barrows, we find that burial usually takes place in these cists. And remember what Cliburn talked about. He said that the Stoneyford items were protected with stones. So was he talking about some sort of a stone cyst? And sometimes they're in Britain, we find that the burial is protected in a lead box or sometimes a stone box as well. That seems to have been what happened up in Drumanagh in County Antrim as well, from the antiquarian records that we have of that. So we have this one here. This is the barrow of the so-called Mercia man down in Essex. Really interesting one. There's a cremation in a glass urn, so again like Stoneyford, and this had been found inside a lead box. So can you see that there's the little glass urn with the cremation in it, and it's in a lead box found in this barrow mound here in Mercia. And isotopic analysis, luckily the Petrus bone survived here, and isotopic analysis of this individual showed that they came from either Germany or Belgium. And then there was this really interesting osteoarchaeological analysis of the cremation done, and it showed that this was a male with a spinal deformity. And there's some of the cremated bone there, and the lead box, and the urn itself. And what was really amazing here was that the osteoarchaeologist looked at the burn patterns on the remains of the spinal bones that had been in the cremation. And there was gaps, very clear gaps, where the bones had not been burnt. And she suggested that this individual may have worn a back brace. which is quite astonishing. But it gets better because there was lipid residue analysis done then of the bones, and they found these traces of what would have been this really expensive Boswellia incense from East Africa, and that had been put on the bones, presumably from one of those little unguentarium, those little vials, after the funeral. So that's the sort of thing we're looking at the time. And a ring barrow, then, I'm pretty certain it would be entirely appropriate for a Roman burial at Stoneyford. Now, what I'm suggesting is that the Ballycombe is likely to have been where the burial was found in 1852. It's a barrow. The three other objects, which were told again by Clibborn that they were found somewhere nearby, we just have no idea what that actually means, where it could have been anywhere nearby. But it's possible that they were recovered from maybe another barrow in the area. While I was working on all this, unbeknownst to myself and unbeknownst to her as well, Aideen Ireland was also trying to figure out where this stuff had been found. Aideen is a good friend of Kilkenny Archaeological Society and former president of the Royal Society of Antiquaries. And in her research, she came to the exact same conclusion, thankfully, that Ballycombe was the most likely find spot of the burial. And her work then has been subsequently published after mine in the Royal Society of Antiquaries. So I've mentioned this place called Drumanagh a couple of times, and that's the only other Roman-style burial barrow that we know of in Ireland. That was found in the mid-19th century, and from what we can tell, it was a big mound, and there was an inhumation burial in a cist there. There was a stone urn, and that had a glass urn inside it, apparently, and a mirror also was reported. So it's very, 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 very similar to what we have in Stoneyford, but right up at the other end of the country. There could be many more of these waiting to be found out there. If we look at the geophysical surveys in and around the promontory fort again at Drumanagh, there's loads of things that look like ring ditches. You see all these little circles all over the place. Some of those could well turn out, if they're excavated, to be the remains of levelled ring barrows, maybe Roman ring barrows. Right, so I think we've found the likely site of the Stoneyford burial. The next step then was we wanted to carry out a geophysical survey of the area and the actual burial barrow itself. So back in July 2014, again as part of the LIARI project, 6 hectare magnetometry survey, it was done on our behalf by the Romano-Germanic Commission of the German Archaeological Institute, so the RGK. And here is, so this is the area overlain on the first edition Ordnance Survey map. So there's our probable Roman burial find spot. There's the other barrow down here I've been talking about. And the red line, that shows the area that was geophysically surveyed. And here are the overall magnetometry results, and you can see they're full of all sorts of interesting circles all over the place, squares, there's pits and all sorts of things, anomalies as they're called, shown. And really what we're looking at here, I think, is an entire archaeological landscape has been revealed in between the two ring barrows. So in the area of the levelled ring barrow itself, you can see that's that here. There's our Roman burial find spot. There's a zoom in on it, and you can see some slight traces of that big ditch that was described to me by the locals. But the whole monument has been completely trashed, and you can see very, very little detail below all that disturbance. But what was really, really fantastic was that right beside it, we got a huge surprise, because there's this completely new completely previously unknown complex of enclosures, about 15 metres away from the barrow where we think that the Roman burial was found. So there's a Roman burial. Look at this, right beside it. That's again a zoom in on it. And you've got a D-shaped enclosure here with a little circle in the middle of it. And then there's a little, what looks sort of like a link passageway. And then it opens up into this big, maybe second enclosure. It's very, very, very unusual. And it could be maybe an early medieval ring fort. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. It could well, that is quite possibly what it is. But I went looking for direct parallels for this particular arrangement, and I couldn't find any. It's very, very unusual, it really is. And it reminds, there's a zoom in on it there again. Can you see that there? So there's a big D-shaped little circle in the middle. And the thing that it reminds me of is these highly distinctive Iron Age settlement enclosures that are found in the south of England and Wales, and they're known as banjo enclosures because they kind of look a bit like banjos. They date from usually around 400 BC up to the Roman conquest in the 1st century AD, and some of them go beyond that as well into the 2nd century AD. Interestingly, some of them are associated with barrow cemeteries, Roman barrow cemeteries, and we have to be very, very cautious about this because the simple fact is that these have never been recognised in Ireland before. We don't have them here. So, the only way we can really get to the bottom of this is by excavating, opening it up and dating it and having a good look at it that way. Now, 250 metres away then to the east, so there again, there's our Roman burial, another lovely circular enclosure here. 26 metre diameter. Is this another ring ditch? Is it a barrow? Does this represent another barrow? Now when you're doing a geophysical survey like this and you've got Romans in your head, the thing you're looking for, it's square or rectangular anomalies, enclosures, because that's what you're typically finding when surveys like this are done in Britain. It's the classic forts and fortlets and shrines and the like. That's how they show themselves in geophysical surveys, and not just in Britain, throughout the Roman world. So when we got the results, there was a great bit of excitement when we saw what seems to be half of a rectangular or square enclosure turning up here, just down to the southeast of the Roman burial. There's just due south of the other ring ditch here. And there's a zoom in on it there. You can see clear as day. Really, really nice square or rectangular enclosure popping out of the geophysics. It's quite large. It's about 50 metres across, and it's defined by quite a narrow ditch. You see that there. And there seems to be lots of little rectangular structures. Maybe you can see that there. Another one maybe here. Look, you have to be very careful about interpreting these geophysical surveys, but certainly there does seem to be something going on in the interior of this square rectangular enclosure. And it's about the right size for a small fort like this one. The reconstruction of one here in Pembrokeshire in Wales, and it's also the right size for many of the kind of Romano-Celtic shrines that are found in Britannia. But I have to be so careful here because we don't know, number one, if any of these features are from our period. We don't know even if they're all contemporary with each other. They may well be all different ages. There's a lot of speculation here. Interesting though, and we need to get in there and excavate these. They're absolutely intriguing, but we need to get in there and excavate. Without that, really, we're just in the realm of speculation. What we don't need to speculate about, though, is that we now have the probable Roman burial site itself, and we seem to have the remains of another ring ditch here. We have maybe 3 ring barrows, and then our big square rectangular enclosure. I've just kind of simplified them here on the first edition Ordnance Survey map. And these results, they clearly support this being the find spot of the Roman burial, and therefore the authenticity of William Perry's discoveries in 1852. And dead people, as we well know, don't bury themselves. And a society, however small, they were here and they performed this particular ritual here. And that this burial implies an established, strong and secure early Roman community, one that understood the symbolism of the Roman funerary practice. And they were living here somewhere 2,000 years ago. There's no doubt about it. This is not some native Irish king or whatever who just takes it upon himself to suddenly take on a completely authentic Roman funeral and all that goes with it. So, have we found something here, the Holy Grail, as I call it, of an early Roman settlement somewhere around here in Ireland? It must be there somewhere, the community that buried this person. The other thing that's important to realise, I suppose, is that when we look to Roman settlements in Britannia at this time, that kind of classic image that we have in our heads of forts and fortifications and towns and villas and all that sort of stuff, your mosaics, and that only represents, it's estimated, about 3% of the maybe 2 or 3 million population of Britain at the time. Everyone else out in the countryside, they continue to live in the vernacular Iron Age enclosed farmsteads with roundhouses. Now they're taking on aspects of Roman ways of life and architecture and objects and some of the Roman economy, but fundamentally they're continuing to live in a way that their great-grandparents would have recognised. And there's a site in Pembrokeshire, again, called Wayland's Rath. This was excavated in 1966 by Jeff Rainwright. And that's here behind me. And settlement continued here in traditional style, adopting Roman material culture. So this, for example, there's been Samian ware pottery found here right up until the 2nd century AD. And maybe this is what might explain, something like this is what might explain the enclosure that has been discovered right beside the ring barrow burial site. Maybe this is where the person who was buried in the Ballycombe burial, where they actually lived. As I keep saying, this has to be a priority for future excavation and research. And we're very lucky that we actually have one of these sites fully excavated, thanks to the M9 motorway being constructed through the area. And I think James Ogan is here this evening, managed and led a lot of the work that took place at that time. This is a really remarkable site called Baysrath. It's just 5 kilometres southwest of Stoneyford, and it's one of the very few late Iron Age domestic settlements that's been subject to large-scale archaeological excavation in Ireland. So the whole thing was opened up and fully excavated. And it's about 40 metres in diameter, you can see here. Big circular enclosure, 40 metres in diameter, very narrow little kind of palisade trench. It's been dated to the 1st and 2nd century AD, so bang on the money for Stoneyford. And inside it, there's 4 circular post-built structures. You can see them there, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then there's a rectangular structure here, and lots of these domestic pits as well. And alongside it, there were a whole series of these cereal drying kilns, and one of them was very interesting because it was a T-shaped Romano-British type of kiln. And this was examined by the burnt grain in it was analysed by Muriel McClatchy of University College Dublin, and she discovered that what they were drying in this kiln was spelt wheat. And spelt wheat is very unusual in Iron Age Ireland. This was the staple in Roman Britain. Now, there weren't masses of Roman pottery, and there was no mosaics or anything like that here, but we wouldn't expect that. What they did find was a Romano-British style leaf-shaped spearhead, which is this one on the left, and possibly some arrowheads as well. They're very fragmentary, but you can see these seem to be arrowheads, and they were identified as being of Romano-British type by Jacqueline Cahill. So there's no reason why our Ballycombe Roman, or maybe their wider community, wouldn't have lived in somewhere like this, or maybe even this particular site. It's not beyond the realm of probability. So we have a lot going on. If we look, even kind of zoom out a bit and look at the surrounding landscape, we can see that Stoneyford and Baysrath as well. It's sited in one of the densest concentrations of recorded Roman sites and objects in Ireland. There's 40 artefacts that we know of dating from the 1st to the 4th century, and we have at least 3 actual archaeological sites. There's Stoneyford, Baysrath, and then Freestone Hill as well, of course. And they're all concentrated within this really well-defined area of lowland in the Nore and the Barrow valleys. It's about 20 kilometres east-west and 15 kilometres north-south between Kilkenny and Thomastown, and then between Stoneyford and the county boundary with Carlow then to the east. And really, it's no coincidence at all that we're finding all of this Roman material in this area, because this was known in early medieval period as the Bealach Gowran. This is the Gowran Pass. And this was the main routeway between kingdoms of Leinster, Line, and Ossory then in the west. And critically as well, this is part of this major trade route called the Slíghe, which is one of the great roads of early Ireland. This leads from Tara to Drumanagh, down through the Gowran Pass and on beyond. So I think the reason that we have all of this Roman stuff here is that it's situated on the Gowran Pass. We also have the rivers, of course. There's the Nore and the Barrow. They're really important routeways. They're directly linking with Waterford Harbour. And we know from Tacitus again that there's Roman merchants that are trading with Ireland in the 1st century. And then there's the map of Ireland that's reconstructed from Ptolemy's geography in the 1st century. And he shows on his map Waterford Harbour and the Barrow estuary. And the north end of the Gowran Pass is crossed by this thing called the Rathduff Dyke. And this is it's a thing called a linear earthwork. It's a bit like that one you might have heard of, the Black Pig's Dyke up in the South Ulster region. And this is a linear earthwork of banks and ditches that originally stretched for about 10 kilometres from the River Barrow here over to the Castlecomer Hills to the west. And it is depicted here back in the 17th century. In 1665 it's actually depicted on the Joan Blue Atlas Mayor map. And if we look at this map that I published there a few years ago, you can see that the Rathduff Dyke, it's set in this amazing archaeological landscape. There's about a dozen barrow cemeteries surrounding it. And then there's this great, presumably late Bronze Age hill fort here, the Ballinkillen hill fort, and then Freestone Hill is just out of picture here, just down here. You've got these 2 great late Bronze Age hill forts overlooking the Gowran Pass, you've got this linear earthwork cutting across the pass. And this is, again, thanks James, the M9 ran all the way through this. You can see it on the map here. There's the M9. And lo and behold, what did they pick up as they went through the area? Lots and lots of late Iron Age activity. Corn drying kilns and furnaces, and very interesting up here at the north, a palisaded enclosure. Looked a bit like what we were looking at there in Baysrath a minute ago. Up here, Mona Duff, and again radiocarbon dated to the 3rd century AD. So the Rathduff Dyke is one of around 5 of these really massive dyke systems from Ireland, and I've argued before that they belong to kind of the same stable as the really identical English and continental Opida settlements of the 1st century BC to the 2nd century AD. And these are massive earthworks of banks and ditches, great statements of power in the landscapes by the Iron Age elites who had them built. And the idea is that they're designed as statements of power, but they're also designed to cut off routeways, just like what we're seeing in this example here. So this is the Gowran Pass, and you've got this great barrier built right across the pass to control movement. And fundamentally, I think they're there to channel people into these trading hubs and places of assembly, burial and settlement. And I've done a lot of work on the Black Pig's Dyke up in County Monaghan there. This is a reconstruction painting of it, by the way. And that seems to be the main purpose of these monuments. And they are really fascinating monuments in their own right. Unfortunately, we don't have any direct dating for the Rathduff Dyke. As the M9 went through it, there was an excavation, but unfortunately nothing datable turned up in that dig. But and there's been a couple of other slices done over the years through it, and none of them have turned up anything datable. But it's something that really needs to be figured out, because I would strongly suspect that it dates from our period, from 1st century BC up to maybe the 2nd century AD. It might even be marked on Ptolemy's map, where he places the Coriandi tribe, and also the historic and never definitely located seat of the Kings of Leinster in this area, which is the famous Din Ree. So I often wonder, is Din Ree actually the Rathduff Dyke and the Opida settlement here? So if you have this kind of pre-existing centre of power and settlement, this is exactly the kind of thing that attracts Romans into your area. You've got a very wealthy elite. Look at the amount of barrow cemeteries that are in the landscape around here, around the Rathduff Dyke. You've got a pre-existing centre of power here. Again, you need to be careful. None of those barrows have been dated. They could be earlier. They could be Bronze Age, but it's a distinct possibility that some of them belong to the Iron Age as well. Now, the other thing that might have attracted Roman activity to this area is its lead and silver resources. And when we look to Britain, when the invasion of Britain, this was nothing to do with state building like what the Romans did in Gaul. This was all about extracting wealth and taxation and natural resources from the country for the rest of the empire. And if we look at where Stoneyford is located, it really can't be any coincidence, I think. That it's just about 3.5 kilometres north, and it's on the exact same promontory as the largest of Kilkenny's historic lead source silver mines, which is on Knockadrina Hill. So when you're driving towards Kilkenny on the M9, and there's that great big hill on the right just before you take the turn off at Danesfort, there's a lovely wooded, very prominent hill. That's Knockadrina Hill. And the Irish Annals and the Din Seanachas, they're full of references to this area and this kind of general area of the Gowran Pass and North Kilkenny as well has been the my arrogate, so the plain of silver. So there's obviously something going on here, and we have analytic references to silver being extracted from this area of Kilkenny as well. We know that the Knockadrina mines themselves, that they were definitely being worked during the Middle Ages and possibly earlier. And what's really interesting is that there's this very distinctive rectangular enclosure which was identified by the late Winifred Young, of the Kilkenny Archaeological Society, and a great friend of the society. She used to work on the reception here in Roadhouse as well. And she identified this site, this rectangular enclosure here, and wrote it up in the Old Kilkenny Review back in 2002 on top of the hill beside the old mine workings. And this is a LIDAR image of the kind of a model of the hills. There's Knockadrina Hill, there's the M9 motorway, and can you see that there? There's a lovely rectangular enclosure with a great big gouge taken out of it at some stage. So look, it's interesting. I don't think we can go any further than that. If we go back to the M9 then, as the M9 came up here, whole series of excavations, and lo and behold, what did they turn up? Late Iron Age settlement, furnaces, metal working, that kind of stuff, right below the hill and down here as well. And it's been pointed out by the LIARI project that this is a very distinct pattern when we look at the distribution of Roman finds and sites in Ireland. There's a very clear correlation between their distribution and areas where there are lead and silver sources. So could we be looking at this being one of the reasons that Roman communities are attracted into this area? There's lead and silver. It's in, the Romans are very, very keen on extracting this from all over the empire. It keeps the show on the road, really. And there are times where it runs low. So it's interesting. So here's a map I pulled together of the entire Gowran Pass area, and it shows all of the known early Roman period, so 1st to 2nd century AD, find spots and excavated sites that would be broadly contemporary with Stoneyford. So here's the Gowran Pass. Kilkenny is up here, just around there. There's Freestone Hill. There's Ballinkillen Hill Fort, and you can see very distinctive Gowran Pass here heading off. Then there's the linear earthwork, the Rathduff Dyke, the north side of the pass. Another interesting and never excavated or really looked at in any detail linear earthwork is over here, just to the south of the city in Cotterill's Rath. And there's the Knockadrina lead silver mine over here. And there's our Stoneyford burial at Ballycombe. And then we have all of these sites. So there's burials, cereal drying kilns, settlements, metal working furnaces, and they all turned up thanks to the M9 motorway and run through the area. And they're closely, dated 1st, 2nd century AD, some into the 3rd century AD. We have early Roman coins from the area as well. This is one from the Emperor Antoninus Pius, a silver denarius from 161 AD. And this was found, would you believe, just across the road from here in my excavations at St. Mary's Church. Now, this is found in much later levels. It's found in 18th century deposits. What's it doing there? What is also of interest, because we're talking about pyres and funerals and stuff, it shows the funeral pyre of the emperor itself. So this is a commemorative coin that is struck at the death of the emperor in 161 AD, and it shows his funeral pyre. Can you see that? We also have a couple of other coins from the area from this early Roman period. There's one up in Jenkinstown to Hadrian
another one in New Ross, which James kindly pointed out to me. And then we have, also from the city, Samian ware pottery. This is the classic Roman pottery. It's produced in Gaul between the 1st and the 3rd century AD. And I found this in excavations that I did on James's Street about 20 years ago. It was found again in 18th century levels in the backyard. Again, it could be something that was just brought in as a souvenir or something and ended up somehow in this backyard. But 2 Roman finds from the city, it's interesting. You know, are these just kind of chance finds that were brought in by later collectors, or are we looking at some sort of late Iron Age settlement activity, whatever, under here somewhere? And I have to mention, there's another site I excavated, the robing room up at St. Canice's Cathedral. This produced a grape pip, and that grape pip has been dated to the first century BC. So you've got a grape pip, you've got grape here in the 1st century BC. So, you know, let's think about that a bit. And then thanks again to the M9 motorway being built, you know, straight through the Gowran Pass. We've around 20 excavated sites in total that have been radiocarbon dated to around the same period as the Stoneyford burial. There's burial ring ditches, there's at Danesfort and Ballinvalley. Their Ballinvalley ones are right below Freestone Hill. There's metal smelting furnaces, there's another roundhouse, a smaller version of the other one at Rathcash, and then there's other traces of settlement as well. And what's really striking are the amount of these late Iron Age corn drying kilns that have been found strewn along the pass. So that's all the red triangles, okay? They're all corn drying kilns that belong to this period. And for example, here's one that was excavated at Holdenstown, where there was a group of 5 of these drying kilns put together there. And there's been a study, a national study done of these corn drying kilns by Mick Monk and Orla Peach Power. And they've suggested that typical figure of 8 shape that you can see here, seems like a figure of 8. Here's a reconstruction of one. This is how they would have worked. So there's a dome over it, there's a platform, and then a flue where the fire is lit. That sucks the air in, and the corn is put on the platform. It's wet. Hot air rises, it dries the corn. Their study, though, is suggesting that these typical figure of 8 shape corn drying kilns, they derive from Romano-British parching ovens. And we've also already mentioned the T-shaped one that Mary McClatchy was looking at. So what these indicate to me is a massive upsurge in primary grain production here in the Gowran Pass. This big upsurge in primary grain production here in the Gowran Pass, like there's nothing like this happening in the Bronze Age beforehand. And question again, is all of this grain being dried for export into the Romano-British market? Is it purely for native consumption, or, you know, is this all being done under Roman control? Another question. And Stonyford and all of this stuff that I've just been talking about, it really sets the stage for a much greater level of Romanized Romano-British material that belongs to the late Roman period. So that's from the 3rd and the 4th century AD, so 200 to 400 AD. And the key site here, of course, is the hill fort at Freestone Hill, which is 15 kilometres to the north of Stoneyford. Excavated by Gerard Bersu back in 1948 to 1949. And where the focus here in the early 4th century it was a Romano-British type shrine up on the top of the hill. And this was first identified by really wonderful work that was done by the late director of the National Museum, Ryan O'Flynn. And this shrine, it was at the centre of the late Bronze Age hill fort. So just there's the ramparts of the late Bronze Age hill fort. And you can see right at the centre here, there's this circular area. And this enclosed an area where there was a whole series of votive offerings were made. And they were provincial Roman bronzes, there was toilet implements, late Roman drinking vessels of pottery, Neen Valley coloured ware, it's called, fragments of penannular silver bracelets, and then there was a commemorative coin of Constantine the Great, which is very closely dated to 337 to 340, and that's that fella here. So there are the bracelets, the toilet implements, and they're all found within this circular area, which was defined by a stone wall, which may have been belonging to the late Bronze Age phase of the site. And they're all found in this lovely black layer, about this thick, that was excavated by Bursu back in the 1940s. And that overlay, in turn, then a early Bronze Age cemetery cairn that had been levelled for this purpose. I did some geophysical survey up here back about 20 years ago, and we found that this might have been enclosed by another concentric ditch here as well. So there's a huge amount going on here at the top of Freestone Hill in the 4th century AD. The coin to Constantine is very interesting as well. These particular coins, they're minted in Trier in Germany by the sons of Constantine the Great to commemorate his death. And the reverse side, as you can see here, so there's the Freestone Hill one, which is not in great shape, and here's a much better one. So you can see there's the emperor on his chariot, and look what's coming out of the sky. This is the Manus Dei, which is the hand of God. And this depicts the emperor in his chariot, and he's been received into heaven by the hand of God. And this is one of the very first Roman coins to include any kind of Christian symbolism on it. It represents Constantine's transition from paganism to Christianity, and also his deified status. So he's famously the emperor who makes Christianity the official state religion of Rome. And remember now, this is a century before Patrick, so this has to be amongst the earliest Christian symbols that we have here in the country. Back to the geophysical surveys that we did up on Freestone Hill. Again, there's the ones I did myself back in 2010, and again the LIARI project did a huge amount of survey work, both up on the hill itself and hectares in the landscape surrounding the hill, done by the RGK. And that work identified an absolutely extraordinary amount of new sites from in and around the hill fort. Loads of other ritual enclosures, unenclosed and enclosed settlements, and then inside the hill fort itself, about 80 house platforms were identified, both by the geophysics and by photogrammetry that was done by James O'Driscoll within the hill fort proper itself. And if we look at the geophysical survey results, so you can see there's the ramparts of the late Bronze Age hill fort, and one area in particular was really fascinating, and that was just down here. It's just outside the bank, the southern bank of the hill fort, and if you see here, it's a kind of oval shaped enclosure, and look inside it, look at all of this, these big pits, and they're arranged in this very, very strange kind of D-shaped arrangement here, right inside that enclosure. And again, need to excavate here, have a look at them.
Are they similar to what's happening up on the summit of the hill? Is there some kind of votive offerings going on here? We have good Roman parallels for these in Britannia, where there's shrines where there's pits are dug and they're filled up with offerings, votive offerings to the gods. We think that the shrine up at the top of the hill, based on the type of objects that are up there, the bracelets in particular, these are offerings to the Roman god of healing in the 4th century AD. And elsewhere then, over just down here, another one of these lovely D-shaped or plectrum-shaped enclosures. Again, could be early medieval, maybe it's a little bit earlier as well. There's, again, good parallels for that in Iron Age Britain. From this late Roman period, again, we have a pair of coins to the Emperor Galenius, who is the emperor between 253 and 268 AD. And these were found back in 2009, right on the banks of the River Nore at Maddoxtown. And they're subsequently published by James Cahill in the Journal of the Royal Society of Antiquaries. And again, we've got lots and lots of corn drying kilns, settlement, industrial activity from this late Roman period, again picked up by the M9. I won't go into it all here now. And we can follow that Roman impact again in the 5th and 6th century into what we call the sub-Roman period. So the early Roman, the late Roman and the sub-Roman. And the sub-Roman is essentially where there are local objects that are influenced by late Roman objects. So they're copying the late Roman stuff in the sub-Roman period, if you get me, a couple of hundred years later. That's where the other 3 objects from Stoneyford belong. So they're sub-Roman, 5th or 6th century, the finger ring, the nail cleaner, and the so-called toothpick. These are 5th to 6th century native copies of late Roman, probably 4th century objects. And again, it was Ryan O'Flynn that figured that particular question out. And I suppose the question here is, do they represent some kind of continuity of settlement in the area of the Roman grave? And again, if we look at the broader landscape around here, look at the Gowran Pass, what do we find? Loads of early church sites. Sites that have Donach Patrick in their name. They're classically, from the patrician period. They're from the very earliest conversion period when Christianity is coming in here. We might have pre-St. Patrick Christianity in this area as well. We have St. Kieran here, who's a missionary, and he's certainly active in this area. He's pre-Patrick. There's also a really dense concentration of Ogham stones. That's the little yellow triangles there. Big concentration. This is one of the densest concentrations of Ogham stones that we have in the country, and they nearly all have this thing called the Cóilín, the formula. And that's essentially it's a Latin Ogham inscription that means "here lies." So the very earliest Ogham stones have this Cóilín formula, and there's loads of them found here on the Gowran Pass. So you've got early church sites, you've got Ogham stones. They are 2 of the great borrowings, of course, from the late Roman world, Christianity and literacy. And they're coming in here into the Kilkenny area quite a bit earlier than in a lot of the rest of the country. We also have pottery from the Mediterranean world, and then there's a few other objects as well that are, and then sites that have been picked up on the motorway excavations. So I think what we're seeing here is the culmination of a process that started in the 1st century with Stoneyford. And it sees Kilkenny really, I think, as the cockpit of a transformation that was taking place in Ireland during this formative period in the evolution of Irish culture and society. And what is now clear, I think, from the evidence in Kilkenny and indeed across Ireland is that the influence of the Roman world certainly on parts of this island has been greatly underestimated. The conquest of Britain, it did not isolate Ireland. Instead, I think it connected Ireland into the Roman world, and that brought new technologies, new ways of living, and as we can see at Stoneyford, new rituals around death and religion. And then look at it from the perspective of the Roman world and its archaeology. I mean, confirming, I think, Stoneyford as the westernmost Roman burial, early Roman burial in Europe, it's really significant for understanding the really extraordinary achievement of this great empire and the impact of it that was felt just, so far outside of its frontiers. Stoneyford, it began as a little sketch and a few scribbled notes in a scrapbook. It's almost forgotten for a century. And I think now it is one of the most important pieces of evidence that we have for understanding Ireland's place in the Roman world. Clearly, as I kept saying all along, we have a lot of important work to do to figure this out still. We need to get in there and excavate at Ballycombe. We need to excavate up at Freestone Hill. But at least I think now we have a roadmap of sorts of where we need to go to excavate and what we need to do. And so this is the next step, and hopefully I can stand here again soon at some stage and share the discoveries with you. So I'd like to just finish by saying, everything I've talked about, the sites and the objects and the typologies and radiocarbon dates and all that stuff, it's all absolutely vital for archaeology, obviously. But archaeology is fundamentally about understanding people in the past, understanding their worlds and their lives, their deaths, how they were treated in death, how they lived, their economy, their society. And for me, one of the most interesting things that the Roman burial at Stoneyford can tell us about is the kind of funeral rituals and the rites that must surely have been performed here nearly 2,000 years ago in County Kilkenny. So, just like today, if someone is buried beneath a headstone with a cross carved on it, chances are they've received a Christian burial and a funeral. And in just the same way, the Stoneyford objects, they tell us that this person was buried by a community with the knowledge, the tradition, and the understanding of the prescribed Roman funerary practice. And that's very, very well documented. We know exactly what that constituted. And because of that, we can travel back to the year, say, 100 AD. The barrow, we're standing beside the barrow in Ballycombe, and we can see a procession of people bringing the dead person set on their funeral bed to the cremation site. The family, they anoint the body with the special oils and ointments that are poured from the little small glass vials, to the sound of a Latin eulogy and the mourning of the dead. And the heir of the family, he lights the pyre with a torch, and fire consumes the body, marking their separation from the world of the living. And throughout the night then, the pyre is carefully tended to ensure a proper cremation, and the remains are accompanied by the family. At dusk then, the bones are collected and sprinkled with ointment before they're placed into a glass urn made from sand from the beaches of Palestine and salt from the lakes of Egypt. The cremation then is placed with a glass vial of ointment in a stone cist inside the tomb, and the open mouth of the urn is covered with a bronze and silver mirror to ward off the evil spirits. The tomb is sealed and a mound is raised over it. A feast then marks the end of the funeral, and only then is the spirit set free to begin their journey across the river Styx to Hades and the underworld. So thank you all very, very much for coming. Thank you all for listening.